Very, very warm welcome to Big Questions. My name's Sunny. I'll be hosting this event today. If you're here for the first time, thank you for coming along. I really hope that you enjoy this lunchtime and find it good and useful for your own thinking. Big Questions, we have a very simple aim. We want to ask and to discuss and to help each other to think about the questions that lots of us have about life, about meaning, and the claims that Christianity makes. And today we're going to be looking at the topic of feminism and faith. To help us think more about this, I'm going to be inviting Elaine Storkey up in a second to give us a short talk, and there'll be plenty of time for questions after that. So do be thinking of any questions that you have for her. Elaine is the former president of Tear Fund, a Christian charity and relief organisation, and in 2010 she co-founded the organisation Restored, which is committed to speaking out against violence against women. We're absolutely delighted to have her speak for us today, so do keep texting in any questions. If you look at the feedback forms on your tables, there'll be a number at the bottom, so do text in to that. Without further ado, Elaine Storkey.
Great, I was halfway through a mouthful. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to, I hope, follow it through. The question is Christianity irredeemably sexist or irredeemably misogynist? And my answer is simply no. But I've got something to say about why it's not. And often Christianity is actually divided very often into a belief system, but also an institution or a set of institutions, in fact, very large institutions. And in order to answer the question, is it irredeemably misogynist, then you have to both look at the belief system and the institutions that embody Christianity. And that's a difficult thing because institutions are worldwide, they're global. There are 2.3 billion people who are affiliated with the Christian faith, and they worship in many different kinds of institutions and denominations and so on. Some denominations are very, very big and very patriarchal. In other words, they're male dominant. Other institutions are very egalitarian, where authority is shared and where the Bible is opened between people as equals, as it were. And so you have to take all of this into consideration when you're trying to answer this question on a global sense. So let's just plow through some of this stuff. You can't see that lovely photograph of a bunch of Indian girls who certainly don't feel that Christianity is misogynist, and they're worshipping in a very powerful way because they feel liberated by the gospel. I want, first of all, to show you some slides that suggest that our history is not a very favourable history if you're looking at the way in which Christians have viewed women or seen them. And these are some of the statements from early church fathers. I've got hundreds of these, would you believe, but I'm only going to show you 4 or 5, otherwise you'd be exhausted. So this is Clement of Alexandria. Every woman should be filled with shame, but the thought that she's a woman. The consciousness of their own nature must evoke feelings of shame. So you see the weight of that. It's a kind of very solemn, very misogynist statement. What's he got against women, you ask, that he wants to make these kinds of statements? But he's not the only one. The early church fathers were very heavy and fulsome in their attitude towards women. So this is John Chrysostom, who in his exegesis was actually very favourable to women. He looked at the Gospels very faithfully and very carefully. But this is what he said in private, if you like. It doesn't profit a man to marry. Watch it, blokes. For what is a woman but an enemy of friendship, an inescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a domestic danger, delectable mischief, a fault in nature painted with beautiful colours? The whole of her body is nothing less than phlegm, blood, bile, rheum, and the food of digestive food. Now, that's not terribly flattering. It's very dismissive. And so you can understand those people who see comments like that and statements like that and draw the conclusion that this is a horribly sexist religion, that it has these kinds of people in its history. Or this is St. Ambrose, again, kicking around in the 4th century. Remember that God took the rib out of Adam's body, not a part of his soul, to make her. She wasn't made in the image of God like man. And there was a big dispute as to what was the image of God and where did it reside. And people like Ambrose every now and again felt it resided in man, in other words, men, male men, but not in the whole human race. And women were made in the image of man, but man was made in the image of God. All kinds of weird thinking populated it. And this is St. Jerome, who was one of the Desert Fathers. And he had a whole bunch of women, unmarried women and widowed women, women looking after him day and night, trotting around. And he gave them advice against marriage, advice against sex and so on, because he thought the real natural state of human life was to be asexual. I don't know how he thought we were going to copulate in the future or what was going to happen to the whole human race, but let's leave that aside. So this is what he says. There's something not good in the number 2. He's looking at the Genesis. He's trying to exegete the scriptures. He's trying to do some hermeneutics. And this is his exegesis. Something not good in the number 2. Our scripture on the first, fourth, sixth days relates that having finished the works of each, God saw it was good. On the second day, he omitted this altogether, leaving us to understand that 2 isn't a good number because it prefigures the marriage contract. Now, that is bizarre. That is really, really weird. And those of you who are biblical scholars here or doing any kind of textual analysis, don't do it this way. Please don't do it this way. Because what's he done? He has brought all his fears and anxieties about women as a desert father, all his worries about sexuality, all his sexual hang-ups, and he's dumped it on the scriptures. And this poor old Genesis chapter, which is a perfectly good chapter where God looks at the creation he's made and says, it's wonderful, look, it's fantastic creation I made. Somehow or another, on the second day, it doesn't recite the same things as it does on these other days. And he draws these absurd conclusions that therefore God isn't in favor of marriage. Again, an example of how not to do it. And then if you come to Odo Cluny, who was a 12th century monk, he just summed it all up. To embrace a woman is to embrace a sack of dung. Now, as I say, I've got hundreds of these quotations. They get more and more salacious. They get more and more detailed. What was going on? What was going on was that there was a tremendous amount of misogyny in the culture as a whole, and it was imbibed by many of the ancient fathers of the church. Of course, these were very early times, times when gendered issues hadn't really been discussed and looked at very, very carefully within the church. But now we've moved on to a different place. And even the Pope, a while ago, this was Pope John Paul, said, I would like to apologize. I'd like to apologize for the forebears, for those early church fathers, for those early Catholics who went around spouting this kind of stuff. And actually, his apology was very, very important. Important for the whole of the history, if you like, of Christianity, because it was wiping the slate clean. It was also getting rid of centuries of gratuitous rudeness towards women from people who actually didn't really think and stop and be anxious about it. So is Christianity inherently misogynist? These are some, again, groups of people. As president of Tear Fund, I traveled across the world, and I found that the sheer liberational aspect of Christianity was unmistakable. As you saw, the effects of the Christian gospel in parts of the world that many of you might not have been to, but actually were incredibly emancipating. And not just for men, but very much for women. This is a whole bunch of women who, according to Indian custom, would normally have been aborted, because there's sex discrimination in India means that there's sex-selective abortion, and if families are large and they've got a lot of girls, they abort the last ones, or there's even infanticide. Why? Because of the dowry. Because the cost of having that girl, taking her through education and then marrying her, and it's the marriage thing is the big thing, is just too much for the average family to bear. So surplus girls get aborted at fetal stage, or they're killed at infanticide. These girls were not. These girls were from parents, Christian parents, who decided that the girl child was far too important, and whatever it cost them in the dowry, and it costs buckets, it could cost a family to be in debt for the rest of their lives, they were hanging on to their daughters. And it's a wonderful story, because a local priest got them together with a whole bunch of fishermen in the neighbouring village who couldn't find wives, and they linked the two together, and it was very amicable. I met the men too. They were very, very dishy, but they were illiterate, and these women were very highly educated. They got degrees. And so the priest, this vicar, wanted to get the men to his literacy classes to improve their education so they would be worthy of their wives. Very different kind of attitude that you get. But there it is in the church too. These are all women who have been discarded because they've been raped. They're in the Congo. The level of violence against women in war-torn situations is horrendous. And again, it's over and over again, it's Christians in the churches, in the counselling areas and so on, who are standing alongside these women and working for their well-being. You can't see him, but right at the very back, can you see there's a kind of stick, somebody holding a stick? That man is my hero, actually. He's a Baptist elder of a local church. And when he heard that these women were making soap, they're soap makers, they've got a soap making factory, and that's their livelihood. They've lost their families, they've been kicked out of their homes because they're rape victims. He went along to see them and said, we would like to trade with you, we'd like to buy your soap. And all our churches would buy your soap. He wants to give them a livelihood. And they were delighted. But one morning he went to look and said, please come and see the factory. When he went round the factory, he discovered that the bubbling soap was acidic, and it was eating away at the hands of the women. And so he went away and prayed about this. And the next day he went in and said, we will buy your soap, and I would like to come and test the temperature of the of the acid and test the acidity of these fumes so that you don't have to do that, and it will save your hands. And so he goes in every day, and his hands are beginning to be eaten away with the acid fumes. And when I was talking to one of these women at the front, none of them are Christians, none of them go to church, about Jesus Christ. She said, well, I've met Jesus Christ. He comes in every morning and tests the acidity of our soap. What was she saying? She's saying she's actually seen something that resembles the gospel as we describe it. That's a different story, a very different view of men and women from the ones that we got from those early church fathers. In fact, our story, if we want to turn really strongly to biblical Christianity, and this is really what the point I'm trying to make. If you look at biblical Christianity, it tells a story of our humanness, our maleness and our femaleness, and that story is in several chapters. And I want to very quickly whip through the biblical story of our humanness and then leave it to you to judge as to whether Christianity is misogynist. And the story could be described in terms of creation. Who are we? What is our role in creation? We'll look at that in a minute very quickly. But also the story of sin and brokenness. God created all of us to be good. God created the world to be good. God created humankind as part of the world. And it was good. And yet in going our way of rebellion from God, we spoilt things and continue to spoil things. The world is spoilt today by evil, by sin, by wrongdoing, by harm, by greed, by a whole range of different things, by exploitation, by violence. And it's people who do that, you and me, and everybody across the world. But the third part of our story is redemption. We see already in the prophets, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, that redemption is going to come. God won't leave you in your misery. God won't leave you in your sin and your screwed up brokenness. But actually redemption will come. That will mean that God is going to buy you back to be part of the creation that he originally intended. God is actually going to change the very nature of your lives and let you start again. And then redemption comes home with a bang in the Gospels, in the New Testament, because that's the whole point of Christianity, is to focus on Jesus Christ, who is the Redeemer, the one who comes to buy us back, the one who comes to die for us, the one who comes to show us how to live, the one who comes to actually be our mediator between us and God. These are huge, big theological truths. I don't expect those of you who are not being born into them or brought up as Christians for a long time to grasp them in a few minutes. It's impossible. But all I can say is that the story that Christianity has about our humanness makes utter sense. Utter sense not just in theory, but actually in practice. And I've seen it in my travels across the world, making sense in every single culture where it's there in evidence, and making sense in the whole theme of gender. And then, of course, there's the final hope of Christian faith, that there is life beyond the grave. We're not just here for 70 years and 10, but there's a great eternity where we can enjoy God and each other forever. How do those chapters pan out in different ways? Well, in the creation story is told in Genesis, but it's also told in the Psalms, it's told in the prophets. It's every now and again the creation story keeps coming back in. And there's a lot about who we are as created persons. So we're created by God, we're significant, we're purposeful, we're not rubbish, we're not here by chance, we're not just robots, we're not autonomous, we're not wired up in certain kinds of ways. We have will, we have purpose, we're significant, we're important. And everybody knows that because you know of your own significance. And people who treat you as if you're not significant actually are making you feel dreadful, but also telling a lie about you. We're also accountable.
we are morally responsible. We're accountable to God, and we're dependent on God, and we're male and female. This is no accident, but this is part of our humanity. And we're made in the image of God, and what does that mean? I think it means that we're made in the image of love. We're capable of loving. We're called to love. This is who we are. We're relational. God is a relational God. We think about God in terms of God's authority and power, but also his intimate relationship within the Godhead, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and so on. This relational God calls us into relationship too. And we're also made to be creative, to be communal, to be interdependent, but we're unique. I find it interesting looking around right now. I can't see two people who look the same. And even when you get identical twins, you know that they're not each other. They're unique. And the sheer quality of our uniqueness made in the image of God is mind-blowing. And yet we're also interdependent. We need one another. We need intimacy in our lives. We need warmth. We need recognition. And this is true whether we're male or female. And so we have those needs of intimacy. We're in relationship with the rest of creation. And we're made as integral wholes. We have to hold together our body, minds, and spirit. We don't fragment. If we fragment, then actually we struggle for identity and our personhood and our wholeness. We're part of creation. Apparently, the DNA of human beings, 98% of it is found in higher mammals, and 33% of it is found in bananas. So we don't get too cocky about our place in creation. But at the same time, we are unique. We are alone, made in this image of God. But of course, that's not, sadly, even though we have eternity in our hearts and we're longing for something, we're longing for significance and meaning, to know it in our lives. That's not the end of our story. And the story of the fall is a story of rejection of God and a bid for human autonomy. We want to do it alone. We want to go it alone. We want to do it our way. We want to make our imprint and not actually follow God's way. And then we see this violation of gender harmony. See, there's been nothing in the story so far, the story of creation, that hasn't been the same true for man and woman and man. This reciprocal echoing, we're both good, we're both wholesome, we both have needs, we're both made in the image of God, and suddenly that harmony is violated. And you get all kinds of prophecies, even in the book of Genesis, that the man is going to dominate, he's going to rule, all the implications of that. And the woman is going to struggle, and she's going to have desire, and theologians argue for ages as to what that word desire means. Your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule. He will dominate over you. And I think that's a prophecy of all the bad things that are going to happen. That's not the way that God intended it. God did not entail male dominance and male violence, male rule and male autocracy, and women to actually be struggling against this. He intended the harmony and the peace. And so there's a difference then in response to creation, but we haven't got time to go into all of that. And you actually see this right through the Hebrew scriptures. You see the sexual sins, the gendered related sins being played out in front of you as the Bible is open and the story progresses. You see violence and aggression and lack of respect. You see abuse of women. You see lying. You see animosity. You see sexual abuse. There are some horrendous stories in the Old Testament of sexual abuse and violation. You also see women manipulators, women using sex to get their own way, because sex is a powerful weapon that women can use against men. And that's part of the sin story. And so on, if you look at all of these. Judges 19. I was a young Christian, and it was a radical feminist who dragged me to the Bible to read to me Judges 19. I hadn't come across it before, would you believe? And it's the story of a concubine who was not getting on well with her husband. She ran away to her father. Her husband pursued her, brought her back. The father didn't want her to go, but eventually she wrestled free, or the husband wrestled free and took her back. And it was late, and they couldn't get all the way home, so they stopped off in the hill country where his kinsfolk from his tribe lived, and found hospitality. That's what Jewish people do. It's a wonderfully hospitable religion and ethnicity. But during the night, we had these marauders came and said, let us have your guest, because we want to have sex with him. And the host says, no, please don't have sex with my guest. That's a violation on my hospitality. Here, have my virgin daughter instead, or his concubine. That'll do. So they take the concubine, they rape her all night, they drop her off next morning. The host and the guest get up, presumably having a good night's sleep, and he says to his concubine, come on, let's go, it's time to go home. She can't move because she's dead. They've raped her to death, and she's lying on the... So he takes her furiously, puts her on his ass, takes her home, cuts her in 12 pieces, sends her around the tribes of Israel and says, look what's happened to me. This is outrageous. What is that story about? It's like many stories in the Old Testament. It is not instructional. Dear people, please remember this. It is not instructional. This is not any suggestion as to how women and men are meant to behave towards each other, and certainly not how men are meant to behave towards women. It is actually a story to shock us. That's why it's in the Bible. It's narrational. It's there in order to show what it's like when a society, when a community actually is not obeying God, is not doing the things that are laid down in the very creation order for our mutual respect, but are doing their own thing their own way. Who suffer? The vulnerable. And who are the vulnerable in this society? Women. And what happens today is a copy of that all across the world. Where power rules, where people are dominant, where sin rules, then the vulnerable suffer. And very, very often, those vulnerable people are women. But, as I said earlier, sin does not have the last word in our story, in the biblical story. There's redemption. And redemption is that's prophesied in the Old Testament. We see women in leadership in the Hebrew scriptures. We see women judges, women prophets, women rulers, and so on. Women who are already beginning to show us something of the redemptive love of Jesus Christ. And then we come to the Gospels and we see the picture of Jesus and women. And lots and lots of promises. Promises in Joel that men and women together are going to be included in the body of Christ. They're going to be gifted in the Holy Spirit. That means that people will have prophetic gifts, will have teaching gifts, will have counseling gifts and nurturing gifts and all kinds of gifts that God gives this community. And we will be called into kingdom work and the new church. All of that is there in the New Testament. And then when you look at women in the Gospels, when Jesus comes, and I could spend hours and hours and hours on this, just the way in which Jesus cuts through the patriarchy even of his age and actually includes women in his relationship with them. Well, all kinds of women. And he has women disciples as well as men disciples. They travel with him. They support him financially in Luke 8 and so on. And if you wanted to have a roll call of some of these women, just look at the ones that you can look at. And each one of those is a powerful story, which we would love to go through, those of you who don't know those stories, because they're revelatory as to how Jesus breaks the mold and changes the whole position and actually elevates women even in that culture. The woman with menstrual problems is very interesting. She's spent 12 years trying to get rid of her menstrual problems and spent all the money she has. She knows that Jesus is in town, but she actually shouldn't be in town. She shouldn't be in the crowd because she's menstruating, and those are the taboos. It's a country where menstrual blood is contaminating, and hygienic rules mean that you don't go out in public, but she does. And not only does she go out in public, she actually touches Jesus' clothes, and instantly the passage says she's made clean. I mean, her menstrual blood stops, and she knows it stops. And she tries to shrink back into the crowds again, but Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples don't understand the question, but everybody's touching you. Look, there's a great crowd around you. Everybody's touching you. And he says, "No, who touched me?" And this woman is forced out into the open. And you might think that's a little bit callous, forcing a woman who's just come quietly and been healed into the open. But it's not callous, because when she falls down and says, "It's me," and waits for the rebuke, "You've got no right to touch me because I'm a rabbi. I now have to go home and change all my clothes and go through 5 ritual ablutions because you've contaminated me." He doesn't do that. It doesn't say anything of that. It simply says, "Go in peace. Your faith has made you whole." In other words, he puts the onus on her, he puts the commendation on her, and he congratulates her for actually having defied the law and entered into a relationship with him. And this is true of almost all of these women. The mold is broken, the patriarchal pattern is split open, and instead you have a new kind of regime being initiated through Jesus. So where do we go from here? We have to understand that this is actually the model of our understanding of women. The Gospels, the epistles, and so on. A lot of people, and I'm going to stop here because I want you to discuss some of this, get terribly worried about St. Paul, saying, didn't he come along and undo all that Jesus did? If they say that, they simply don't understand St. Paul. There's an awful lot of Paul's writings where he's trying to hold the church together in unity. That's the whole focus of St. Paul. And the church is very divided. It's coming from people who are rich and poor, who are slaves and free, who are male and female, who are young and old, and from many, many different kinds of cultures. How does he hold them together? Paul all the time is asking them to be respectful of one another. And the word he uses very often is submit. Submit to one another. Submit to one another. And so this is true of women and men too, in all their roles and relationships. So was he a misogynist or was he a liberator? And I'm putting my cards on the table. I know and I believe and I've experienced and I've seen people who understand the Pauline letters and seen the liberation it has in their lives. Let's just quickly go and now finish on this one. What is Paul's teaching? And there are some people who will just stress in the church these aspects of Paul's teaching. That women are to learn in submission, that women should be silent in the churches, that they shouldn't teach or have authority over men, and that wives should obey their husbands. Each one of those passages has to be put in context and understand what actually is going on in the whole context of that. Once you do that, it's got a very different meaning from what it sounds like when you're looking just at the bare words. In fact, and you've also got to look at the Greek. The word for silent isn't silent in Greek, it's quiet. And the context of that is where there's chaos in the church, where everybody's speaking at once, where everybody's prophesying at once, and women particularly are chattering. And the image that Paul gives is of chaos in the church, confusion, disorder. We're not hearing the word of God because of the racket going on around us. And so he draws everybody in. He gives them all instructions to stop doing that and allow the Holy Spirit to minister. Other people will stress these aspects of Paul's teaching, that in Christ there is no male or female, but the barriers have been broken down. And that women should pray or prophesy, but they should have their heads covered as a mark of respect, so to distinguish them from the Baalite prophets and all of the other pagan religions around. That the church should accept the leadership of Phoebe, as Paul says at the beginning of Romans. He sends Phoebe right across with Asia Minor with a letter to the Roman church and asks them to accept her leadership because he accepts it too. And the authority within the marriage is mutual and reciprocal. I haven't got time to go into all of that, but actually that's in 1 Corinthians 7. So which are you backing? Well, you can actually do it all. You can hold the two together, and many people in the church do. And the important thing is to recognize that it's the same text. It's not discarding the biblical text. It's coming to the biblical text and bringing our hermeneutics, bringing our interpretive framework, bringing our knowledge of the context and knowledge of the scriptures and so on, and working it out together, very often in fear and trembling. And the other thing is that we actually also have to watch what Paul does as well as what Paul says. And Paul does allow women to teach, otherwise I wouldn't be standing here today if I were a faithful Christian. In fact, he commends women who are teaching in the church. And he does commend the activities and the leadership of a lot of women. And he does endorse this mutuality in marriage, where he endorses respect for women to give to their husbands and love for husbands to give to their wives. Why does he choose those two? Why does he say, husbands, love your wives, and wives, respect your husbands? And I think it's when he looks at the church, that's what's missing. And I'm a social scientist. I spend a lot of time counseling people. And do you know what? Many marriages today, when they break down and you ask what really finally drove you to the end, the two things that often come up are very similar to what Paul points out, even in the Corinthians. And those are that men often say, this woman didn't respect me. She humiliated me. She offended me in public. She didn't actually engage with me. I just didn't feel any respect from her. And the women will say, this man never really loved me. He didn't cherish me. He didn't want to be with me. He didn't really want that kind of closeness and warmth and intimacy. Isn't it interesting? That's often what's wrong with our marriages today. And Paul saw it all those time ago in Ephesians. Anyway, I'm finished now. All I wanted to say is that the rest of the New Testament is there. And when we try and understand the biblical understanding of what the Bible really says about men and women, it uses 4 concepts, and it plays about with them all the time. That we are different from each other, but we're also the same as each other. We have the same needs, we have the same longings, we have the same ontology, if you like, the same humanness. We also complement each other. We fit together in all kinds of ways. But most of all, we're made to be in union. in union as two halves of the human race, respecting one another, loving one another, endorsing one another, affirming one another, building one another up, and most of all, encouraging one another in our walk with God. I finished.
Great. Thank you very much, Elaine, for that. Oh, is this? Yeah. I'd just like to apologise that we didn't give a trigger warning for the references to sexual violence. I'm really sorry about that, for any distress that caused. There'll be a moment now to text in any questions that you have, and we'll be back up in a moment for a short Q&A. Thank you. Hello. Hi. Sorry to interrupt your conversations. There'll now be some time for questions. Does anyone have a question from the floor? Yes, down here. Could we have the mic? There should be a mic. Yeah, just down here, the front table. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Whilst the mic's coming, I've written a book. It's not even published yet. I've just got a few copies that pre-publication. It's going to be published on the 25th of November, which is the UN Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women. It's my Christian response to global violence against women. It's called Scars Across Humanity. If you want to browse it, I've put a few ones at the front.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question about feminism rather than Christianity. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think a person needs to identify as a feminist and actively participate and be in cahoots with feminism as a movement in order to, well, not to be a misogynist and to have a valid belief in the political, social, and economic equality of men and women?
No, you don't need to, of course not. No, there are many people who are entirely one with the whole, what we call a feminist vision of women, who wouldn't identify with feminist movements because they don't like movements and they don't like big gatherings of people, and they're a little bit frightened of a lot of women who might look a bit strident. So no, you don't have to. And sometimes, even when you don't, you're forced into it. So I never called myself a feminist, but other people started to call myself feminist. And I suddenly found myself invited to all kinds of feminist gatherings all over the place for years and years and years. And women who are feminists recognize me as one of them, which is wonderful because then you have a great relationship and you can build on that relationship and share a lot more. And I think in my case, you can take the sting out of their anxiety about Christianity. So there are pros and cons, but you don't have to identify publicly as a feminist. But you do have to identify publicly in terms of understanding and approving and endorsing the rights of women.
Great, thank you. We'll take one that's texted in. Why did God not do more when communicating with the Israelites in the Old Testament to change the social structures that saw women as submissive to men?
Why didn't God do more? I think in many ways God did an awful lot. So if you read the prophets, and especially Joel, and get that extraordinary prophecy where women are going to be included and where there aren't going to be these differences in hierarchy and so on. But also God spends a lot of time rebuking the blokes who actually damage women. So when Abraham lies about Sarah and pretends she's his sister, not his wife, to save his own skin, because she's very attractive and they're going to rape her and going to take her. And if she's his wife, they're going to kill him. God rebukes that. I mean, that's actually not on. And there's a whole range of ways in which God does address the iniquities of the Old Testament. And also the way in which you get approbation in the text for the people like the Hebrew midwives, Shipra and Puah, who defy the pharaohs in order to bring birth to the male children. So you have to look for them. They're quite hard, but I think it's not the case that God simply endorses or does nothing about the patriarchy of the Old Testament. He spends ages and ages. And of course, there's passages too with where women are come along to Moses and demand their rights of inheritance because the male line is now annihilated, which are all incorporated into the law. It's a complicated patriarchal society, but things are happening all the way through.
Thank you. Would anyone like to come back on that? I think we have time for one more question. Or another question from the floor. Oh, yes, just...
So we didn't really get to it, but looking at the Christianity as an institution, as it is, as the church, and obviously there are many branches of Christianity, but in many of them, women don't get the same roles within the structure as males do. So would you say that that is all right, or that that is wrong in some sense?
See, I'm not here to pass judgment on different institutions in society or different Christian institutions. They have to work this out. I am there to in a sense, be redemptive in my own tradition, which I have been trying to do all my life, really, ever since I became a Christian, asking what does a redemptive Christian worship and Christian institutions look like? I think you find even in those institutions where women are not maybe leading from the front, or they don't become archdeacons or popes or whatever, nevertheless, the women are playing significant roles a lot of the time. And you have to therefore endorse that. And there's movement going on all the time in these institutions, a lot of movements. And in many of these institutions, women have done very, very powerful things in the social order, in the public sphere as well. And those are endorsed. So we're all on a journey with God. And different institutions are on a journey with God. And I think they're on a journey out of patriarchy. And I want to pray that that journey will speed up for the sake of women and will release far more many women than are being released at the moment. But if you talk to women in these traditions, they don't feel stymied. Some of them do. Some of them feel very angry. But the majority will also point to liberational things within their religion, within their tradition, that they hang on to and are very important.
Thank you very much. You can sit down. Great. I'm really sorry that we ran out of time there. And Elaine is happy to stick around, so do come and chat to her. Otherwise, do stick around and chat to those on your table. And I'm really sorry if you didn't get a seat as well. Thank you for coming along. Thank you that you've made it such a good event. If you're here today for the first time and just considering some of these things, and you'd really love to meet up and chat over a cup of coffee maybe with someone, then please do fill in those feedback forms. You'll notice there's a box saying, I'm interested. If you could tick that and leave your name, your college, and your email, someone in the Christian Union in your college will get in touch with you over the next couple of days. This is just a really casual chance to meet up and chat and go through some of the more personal things that you'd like to ask. Great, and if you could put those in the feedback form at the back, and the feedback form box at the back. And next to the box, you'll notice there are a variety of Christian books, and there'll also be Elaine's book. If you're here today as a guest of the CU, then they're completely free, so do grab a look, and if any of them take your fancy, grab one on your way out. Big Questions will be back next week at the same time. We're going to be tackling the topic of how do we make sense of suffering, and we'll have Dr. Vince Vitale speaking on that. So that should be a really good event. So please do come back for that. For now, if you have to rush off to a lecture, please do feel free to leave. If not, do stick around, and there'll be some snacks coming around. And have a lovely weekend. Thank you.